Okay. So we're diving deep today into a couple of pieces from The Economist.
Okay.
March 29th, 2025, U.S. section.
That's good.
And what's interesting is at first glance, these feel like totally separate stories, you know, but you flagged these for us, and I think it's going to be really interesting to see how they connect up.
Yeah.
The first one is about this new AI enforcer at the DOJ.
Right.
Which the article calls DOGE.
Yeah.
And the second is this battle over redistricting in Louisiana.
Uh-huh.
So, on the surface, they seem like they're totally different things. But
Surely.
But our goal, as always, is to kind of dig beneath the surface and see if we can pull out the important insights and what really matters for folks like us,
Yeah, and I think if we dig a little deeper, you'll see some really, really compelling connections between these two stories.
Yeah.
We're talking about, how government authority is being deployed in two very different ways.
Yeah.
One through technology, and one through, the very foundation of how we choose our representatives.
Yeah. Okay. So let's unpack this a little bit, starting with this DOGE.
Yeah.
Which sounds pretty ominous, right? The DOJ's AI enforcer.
It's a little scary.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like something straight out of, like a dystopian sci-fi movie.
Yeah.
But what's so interesting about this is that this Digital Operations Group for Enhanced Law Enforcement,
right,
which is what DOGE stands for, was actually established in 1984.
Wow.
By Congress.
Okay.
And get this, its original goal was to promote an end to conflict. I mean, how ironic is that, right? DOGE starts in 84 to promote peace.
Right.
And now it's this AI enforcer that's focused on basically efficiency.
Wow.
And it really highlights how, even with the best of intentions, these government initiatives can just totally change, as priorities change and administrations change.
Right.
So, what does that tell us about, the long-term vision or lack thereof in government,
It's a great point. This idea that the goalposts can change so dramatically over time.
Yeah.
And that institutions adapt to these new demands and priorities. I mean, ending conflict is a pretty quaint idea compared to what they're doing now, which is cutting costs.
Right.
And, that seems to be their main goal now under the executive branch, particularly with Donald Trump's focus on shrinking the government, making it more efficient.
Yeah. And speaking of the executive branch, the article actually makes this pretty bold claim that DOGE is essentially headed by Elon Musk.
Wow.
Like, as in, Trump has basically become Musk's enforcer within the government. Yeah. Now, the article admits there's no, official organizational charts or anything like that to back this up. But it points to the fact that a lot of longtime Musk loyalists, like Steve Davis, for example, are playing key roles in DOGE.
I see.
So it's really hinting at Musk's influence. Yeah. But without concrete proof, is it possible that this is, a bit of speculative reporting, just fueling this narrative that we always hear about, big tech's reach into the government?
That's a good point to raise.
Yeah.
I think that even if there isn't a formal structure or direct leadership, the connections are definitely there.
Yeah.
And that's something that we should pay attention to.
Yeah.
It suggests that, the tech sector could have a lot of influence on the government in ways that we might not even be aware of.
Right.
And that raises questions about, accountability.
Right.
And whose priorities are really shaping policy.
Absolutely.
And if it's not being done in a transparent way, that's a concern.
Yeah. So here's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
This article gives us a little peek into what it's like to actually work at DOGE.
Yeah.
And it sounds pretty intense.
Right.
Like, they're talking about overcrowded headquarters, people working crazy long hours, even sleeping at their desks.
Really?
I mean, it sounds more like a high-pressure tech startup than a government agency.
Right.
And then there's this detail about a recent voluntary separation offer, which the article kind of implies is connected to low morale and burnout.
Oh, wow.
Which, doesn't exactly scream efficiency and optimal performance, does it?
No, not at all. It sounds like there's some pretty serious issues, if people are that burnt out.
Yeah.
it makes you wonder how sustainable this is in the long run.
Exactly.
You can push people hard for a while.
Yeah.
But eventually something's got to give.
Yeah, and all of that brings us to this whole, growing list of concerns and criticisms about DOGE. Okay. and the biggest one seems to be this lack of transparency.
Right.
Like, we don't really know how DOGE operates, what its structure is, who's really in charge. Yeah. It's pretty murky.
And that's worrisome for an agency that has this much power.
Right.
When you give an agency the authority to enforce the law using AI, you need to know how they're making decisions.
Right.
Who's accountable.
Exactly.
Transparency is crucial.
Absolutely.
Especially in a democracy.
Yeah. And that lack of transparency kind of feeds into the next big concern, which is the potential impact on civil liberties.
Right.
Because, if DOGE's main goal is to cut costs, then what's to stop them from cutting corners when it comes to, due process and legal safeguards?
It's a slippery slope.
Right.
If efficiency becomes the only thing that matters, then what happens to individual rights?
Yeah, it's a really important ethical question. Are we willing to sacrifice our rights in the name of saving money and being more efficient?
Or are there some things that are just more important?
Yeah. And then on top of all that, you have these reports of staffing problems at DOGE. Apparently, they're having a really hard time attracting and keeping qualified people.
Oh, wow.
Especially people with, the scientific and software engineering skills that you would think they'd need to be an AI enforcer.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine them doing anything really sophisticated with AI if they don't have the right people.
Exactly.
You need experts to build and maintain these systems.
Right.
And it sounds like they're struggling to do that.
Yeah. And then there's the budget.
Yeah.
I mean, the article mentions that DOGE is taking up a whopping 5% of all federal spending.
5%? I mean, that's a huge amount of money.
Yeah, that's a lot of taxpayer dollars.
Right.
And it makes you wonder if they're actually getting their money's worth. Right.
Especially with all the other problems they seem to be having.
Yeah, I mean, how does DOGE's performance even compare to more established law enforcement agencies like the FBI,
right?
Or state and local police forces?
A good question. Those agencies have been around for a long time.
Right.
They have a lot of experience.
Yeah.
They've developed procedures and protocols.
Right.
DOGE is still pretty new.
Right.
It's growing really fast.
Yeah.
And it's not clear that they've figured out all the kinks yet.
Yeah. And finally, the article touches on this idea of a broader techlash.
Okay.
Which is basically, this growing skepticism about the influence of big tech, both from the public and from within the government itself.
I see.
And it almost feels like DOGE is a manifestation of that. Like it's the government's way of trying to harness and regulate this power of tech.
It's like they're trying to fight fire with fire.
Right.
Using AI to control AI.
Yeah, right.
But it's not clear that they've thought through all the implications.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we've waded through the murky waters of DOGE.
Yeah.
Now let's switch gears completely.
Okay.
And head down to Louisiana.
Right.
Where there's this huge battle going on over redistricting.
Yeah.
And this is all about the state's current congressional map. And whether it's racially gerrymandered.
Right.
So just to clarify for anyone who's not familiar, redistricting is the process of redrawing the boundaries of electoral districts.
Right.
And it usually happens after each census to account for changes in population.
Okay.
So in Louisiana, the argument is that the current map violates the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was this landmark piece of legislation designed to prevent racial discrimination in voting.
Okay.
And the claim is that the map only creates one majority black district.
Out of six.
Out of six. Even though black people make up about a third of Louisiana's population.
Wow.
So basically they're saying that the map is diluting the voting power of black citizens across the state.
So a group of black voters in Louisiana decided to sue.
Right.
And a 3-judge federal court actually agreed with them.
Wow.
They said that the map probably violated the Equal Protection Clause
of the Constitution
and the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
And they ordered the state to create a second majority black district.
Yeah, that's a pretty big ruling.
It was a huge win for the people who brought the lawsuit.
Right.
The court basically said that race had been used to draw the district lines.
Right.
And that was illegal.
Right.
So they had to redraw the map.
Right. To make it fair.
To
black voters.
Exactly.
But, of course, Louisiana wasn't just going to accept that.
Right.
So they appealed the ruling.
To the Supreme Court. Okay.
And their main argument is that race was just one factor.
Among many
that they considered when they were drawing the map. And they also claim that the map is actually pretty partisanly neutral as it is.
So they're trying to say that they didn't intentionally discriminate against black voters.
Right.
That it was just a coincidence that the districts ended up the way they did.
Yeah. And they're even going a step further
and
saying that creating a second majority black district would itself be unconstitutional because it would be racial gerrymandering.
Right.
So basically they're saying that you can't use race
to draw districts, even if you're trying to fix past discrimination. Even if you're trying to make things fair.
Yeah. It's a really tricky legal argument.
It is.
Yeah.
It gets to the heart of what the Equal Protection Clause really means.
Right.
Does it mean that the government can never consider race?
Right.
Or does it mean that the government can consider race in certain circumstances?
So level the playing field.
Right. It's a tough question.
So what are the potential outcomes here?
Well, the most obvious one is that the Supreme Court could uphold the lower court's ruling.
Right.
And force Louisiana to redraw the map.
Right.
With a second majority black district.
Right. And that would likely lead to
a change in Louisiana's congressional delegation.
Right.
It could shift the balance of power in the state.
Yeah. But this case also has implications.
To go way beyond Louisiana.
Right.
This is about the fundamental right to vote.
Right.
And whether our elections are fair.
Right.
And it's about how we balance the need for partisan fairness with the need to protect minority voting rights.
Right.
A really important issue.
Yeah. And the article also mentions this broader conservative legal strategy that's kind of behind this whole argument against using race in redistricting.
Right.
And it's a pretty influential strategy.
It is, based on this idea that the government should be colorblind, that it shouldn't see race at all.
Right.
And that's a very appealing idea to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But it also ignores the reality that race still matters in America.
Right.
And that we haven't achieved true equality yet.
So just to be clear, if the Supreme Court sides with the lower court, the actual job of redrawing the map will probably fall to the middle district of Louisiana.
That's right.
It'll be up to them to come up with a new map that meets all the legal requirements. And it's interesting that the article also mentions Operation Lone Star in another section, which is related to the border crisis. And it just kind of highlights all the other challenges that Louisiana is facing at the same time as all this.
Yeah, they're dealing with immigration.
Yeah.
They're dealing with voting rights.
Right.
They're dealing with all sorts of things.
Yeah, so let's try to bring these two stories together.
Okay.
We've got DOGE, this new AI entity at the DOJ.
Right. And we've got this redistricting battle in Louisiana.
Yeah.
What are the connections?
Well, I think the main connection is that they both show how tricky it is to implement top-down mandates.
Right.
Whether those mandates are technological or political.
Yeah.
You've got DOGE, which is all about using technology to make the government more efficient. And you've got the redistricting plan, which is all about using political power to achieve certain outcomes. And in both cases, there's a risk of unintended consequences.
Right.
If you're not careful, you can end up undermining people's rights.
Exactly.
Or creating more problems than you solve.
And it seems like this tension between government efficiency and individual rights is really at the heart of both of these stories.
Absolutely. In the case of DOGE, the push for efficiency could lead to the erosion of due process and civil liberties.
Yeah. And in the case of the redistricting map, all about whether black voters are being denied their right to equal representation.
Right.
And both of these issues are incredibly important.
Absolutely. Okay, so to sum up, DOGE is a pretty controversial agency.
It is.
It's growing rapidly. Yeah. It's got a lot of power.
Right.
And it's not clear that it's being used responsibly.
Right.
Meanwhile, in Louisiana, there's this ongoing fight over redistricting that really gets to the heart of what it means to have a fair and democratic society. So here's a final thought for you.
Okay.
How are all these technological advances and legal battles going to shape the future of government and individual rights?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Right.
We're living in a time of rapid change.
Yeah.
And it's not always clear where we're headed.
Right.
But it's important to pay attention and to ask questions.
Yeah.
And to make sure that our voices are heard. Because the decisions that are being made today are going to have a huge impact on our lives for years to come.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It's always great to chat with you.
Likewise.
And we'll see you next time.
See you then.